In the last few years, there's been a trend towards native gardens. Everyone's going around telling you, get rid of that garden you have and start planting natives. Create gardens that have only native plants because they grow better. They're easier to take care of. They've co-evolved with the native insects, and so we need more native plants. Growing native plants is certainly good for the environment, and it's good for biodiversity. But in the last number of years, there's been some really good research that's been done about traditional gardens, trying to understand the value of those for the environment and for biodiversity. And we now know that a lot of the things you've been told about native gardens isn't true. And some of the proponents of native gardens are spreading myths, trying to convince you to their way of thinking. In this program, I'm going to have a look at some of these myths and try to understand what is the benefit of a traditional garden. If you garden with only a few native plants, or maybe no native plants, is that any good for the environment? How does that affect the insect population, the biodiversity of insects and birds in your garden? Myth: traditional gardens aren't good for wildlife. Dr. Mark Goddard has studied this, and he's an urban ecologist and said, residential gardens make up half of the total green space areas in cities, an extent that translates into huge potential for wildlife benefits. Gardens are beneficial for wildlife even if they don't contain a lot of native flowers and still have a patch of lawn. Native wildflower meadows have some benefits, but so do all of the other types of gardens. In many countries, private gardens are the major component of urban green space and can provide considerable biodiversity benefits. In 1966, zoologist Charles Elton dismissed the value of gardens, describing them as biological deserts. In the years since then, our understanding has gradually changed as a result of many studies that looked at life in urban gardens. We now know that even non-native plants and lawns contribute substantially to wildlife diversity. A study that looked at the flora in 267 urban domestic gardens in 5 UK cities found 1,056 species, of which 30% were native and 70% alien. 34% of the most frequently recorded species were native, and a number of them were weeds. Gardeners love adding new plants and changing plant communities, which can result in more plant diversity than in natural habitats. My own garden is a good example. I grow over 3,000 different types of plants in all types of habitats, including bogs and ponds. Without intervention, the property would be a sugar maple and beech forest with small areas of meadow. The current garden is much more diverse. Another myth: gardens need to be big to have an impact. It is a common belief that gardens need to be large to be important to wildlife, especially for insects and birds. The reality is that small gardens are located next to other small gardens, and most wildlife doesn't care about fences. From the point of view of a flying finch or a flying ladybug, it all looks like one big garden. Several studies have shown that garden size doesn't correlate to invertebrate richness, and that garden size is not important for nectar availability. Plant diversity and garden management are more important. Even balcony gardens contribute to wildlife. Another very common myth is that plants have to be native. The purists are convinced that all plants in a wildlife garden need to be native species. Although natives can add some extra benefits, the environment also benefits from non-native plants, and in some ways they are a better option. One reason for having a garden is for aesthetic reasons, and cultivated plants can be more pleasing for these types of gardens. They also offer a wider range in style and color, making the garden more interesting. The number of animal species in a garden is not related to the native status of plants and depends more on the quality and variety of plants. One limitation of native plants is that they may not extend the seasons as well. In my garden, non-native snowdrops are one of the first to flower, and they are always covered in insects, including large bumblebees. The flowers of local native plants won't be available for another couple weeks. Some non-natives are better at dealing with early frosts, such as tulips, narcissus, winter aconites, and many alpine plants. The same occurs in fall. You can select late-flowering exotic plants to provide nectar well past the point of native plants. My butterfly bush is always covered by butterflies in late fall because it provides a better nectar source than my native goldenrod, at least for butterflies. Beetles and flies prefer the native goldenrod. Non-native roses provide pollen and nectar right up until frost. Myth: lawns are not good for wildlife. Natural gardeners have no use for lawns and feel that it should be removed, but they ignore some basic facts. Lawns play an important role for those who want to use the garden for something other than plants. There is no better choice for a living, durable surface for foot traffic. Aesthetically, it is also an attractive part of any garden design because it enhances the look of the flower beds. The problem with lawns is not their existence, but the intensive way we maintain them. They don't need to be pristine and weed-free. They can be grown with no irrigation in most locations, and pesticides can be vastly reduced or eliminated. Studies have shown a significant environmental benefit from lawns grown in a less intensive way. Less frequent mowing at higher heights improves insect populations and plant diversity and reduces costs by 35%. The OptiMow project tested mowing frequency and found that mowing once every 2 weeks increased pollinator numbers by 75%. Granted, we do have too much lawn. For example, the front yard lawn is rarely used and does little to enhance the look of the garden. Ground cover would be a much better choice in that situation. Another myth: native gardens should be messy. One of the big arguments against natural gardens is that they look messy. Think wild meadow. But that does not have to be the case. Native plants can be added just like any other perennial. In fact, in my garden, Aspen Grove Garden, I grow many native plants. And if you visit the garden, it doesn't look anything like a traditional native garden, because I control the spread of natives in the same way that I control the spread of non-natives. Dr. Mark Goodard said, social norms of tidy gardens can be detrimental to biodiversity. Insect biodiversity, especially bees, does decrease with tidiness. Weeds can also increase biodiversity. However, there are extremes to tidiness, and perhaps a middle road approach is warranted. Stop having perfectly manicured lawns and shrubs. Let the grass grow a bit longer. Don't pick up every dead leaf. Even with these changes, the garden can still look well maintained and does not need to be a complete mess. Another option is to leave part of the garden a bit wilder and maintain the rest. Letting parts of your garden grow wild with long grass can increase butterfly numbers up to 93% and attract a wider range of species, according to new research. Myth: native plants grow better. A common but incorrect claim is that native plants have evolved for your location and therefore are better adapted to your garden. Plant native and you will have less problems with pests and diseases. Native plants are also claimed to solve all kinds of garden problems. This is a big myth that assumes all non-native plants grow in an environment completely different than yours, and that is highly unlikely. It also assumes that your yard is a place where all native plants thrive, which is also false. Native plants only grow well when they are situated and maintained properly. This should really be obvious to everyone. Have you ever gone for a walk in the woods in eastern North America? Did you see a lot of goldenrod? It is a weed and grows everywhere, but not if there's too much shade. The common goldenrod species, Solidago canadensis, prefers full sun, so it doesn't grow well in shady areas. The marsh marigold is another native here, but it does not grow in dry soil. It does well in wet ditches and ponds. Lobelia carnalis, the cardinal flower, is also a native, and I love it, but it just won't overwinter for me. On the other hand, the blue lobelia and hybrids between the two species grow easily in my garden. In fact, the blue lobelia is too weedy and needs to be controlled, even though it's a native. I grew some bush honeysuckle from seed and planted it in my sugar bush. It can be an aggressive shrub, but I figured shade would control its spread. Nope. What a weed. It is taking over the wooded area and is eliminating native ephemerals who just can't compete with the shrub. Another native, Anemone canadensis, is also a terrible weed in sunny locations. Once you decide you don't want it anymore, it can take years to remove it from a garden. Native plants are great and easy to grow, provided you pick the right ones and plant them in the right spot. Just like any non-native, the wrong plant in the wrong spot does not work. So what can you do to attract wildlife? The following are some great ideas that allow you to combine native plants with conventional plants in a semi-formal garden. Install a natural pond. Water increases biodiversity more than any other option. Reduce your lawn area where you do not need a lawn, such as the front yard. If you don't want to remove it completely, just allow some of it to grow long. Stop being a neat freak. A few sticks or dead leaves laying on the ground is good for nature, and you will soon accept it as a way of life. Don't clean up in fall. Insects and birds need the fall debris to overwinter. Allow your front garden to become a bit less formal and a bit more messy. As you change, neighbors will follow you. Years ago, everyone on my street had lawns in the front yard. I removed some of it and made a nice looking garden. I got positive comments, and soon others on the street were putting in gardens in their front yard. Add more shrubs, especially ones that produce nectar and berries for wildlife. Grow annuals that flower and produce nectar all season long. Stop killing every bug you see. Predators stay away from your garden if you don't have something for them to eat. I hope that you can now appreciate the value of traditional gardens a bit more. They're not nearly as bad for the environment as people have led you to think. Now, if you want to go native, that's still great. Growing native plants is a good idea, and everyone should grow some native plants. But if you enjoy the type of gardening you're doing now, that's better than having a lawn with no garden. Now, I've created a couple other videos that will be of interest to you. This one here talks about fall cleanup. Is that something you should be doing? And this one here talks about cleaning up the leaves in fall. Where should we clean them up and where should we leave them? Happy gardening.